Hi there, Year 11. Okay, welcome to part two of our recorded revision lesson for paper one, which you're going to be sitting later this week. Um, Now, before we get started, um, this revision lesson is more focused. I thought it was important to just focus a little bit more on some of the exam questions and how we structure our answers and perhaps what to expect. So last year, I recorded very in-depth revision lesson for paper 1B, and that's in three parts. And I'm going to post the links to that revision lesson um, in the same thread on Teams as when I share this one. That's more content based, and hopefully you've watched it a few times. Go back to it. This is using a slightly different resource, an updated resource, and the emphasis here is a little bit more on, as I say, exams and potential exam questions. So I know most of you have probably looked at the three-part revision lesson from last year, so I felt it was important to use this as an opportunity to freshen it up a little bit, and also, as I say, potentially have a think about what might come up this year, okay, and how we approach the questions. So, without further ado, let's just remind ourselves then. Okay, so questions one and two, the source questions, you can see there which topics have come up since 2018. Now, again, it has to be said that just because NATO came up in 2018 doesn't mean to say, sorry, as question one, doesn't mean to say it could come up again as a source question for question two. And likewise, just because the Berlin Wall came up as question three doesn't mean to say it could be the stated factor for question four, or it might even come up as question two. It came up as question one in 2021 as a source A, or what's to say it could come up this year as question two in sources B and C. So the point I'm making, the point I've made a few times before now, is just because a topic has been assessed, so as a question one, for example, doesn't mean to say that it won't be assessed again as a question two, three, or four. So we need to be prepared for that. Okay. Well, let's get into question one then. So we're going to start. Just have a think about actually what question one and two are sources questions. So it's quite possible that the arms race, the 1950s, and space race in the 1950s could be the focus of either question one or question two this year. It could be there's a possibility that the U2 crisis could well be the focus of question one or two. Now, in last year's revision lesson and on last year's resource, which will also be reposted under this thread on Teams, there is some good sources on that presentation about the U2 crisis, so do have a look at that. Vietnam and the whole Cold War in Asia, and that's something that hasn't really come up at all for question one and two. So that is something, again, we need to be prepared for. Cuban Missile Crisis is yet to come up for question one or two. And if you've got the revision guides and the textbooks, there's some very good source material on the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's the picture of Khrushchev and Kennedy, of course, having an arm wrestle onto hydrogen bombs, and that source is on the other presentation and was featured in the lesson last year. So again, go back and have a look at that. All right, so I haven't got a crystal ball. I can't tell you what's going to come up, but looking at what has come up in the past of questions one and two, we can make an educated guess and we can anticipate what could come up. So, just want to talk a little bit about source work. Not so much for question one, well, yeah, certainly for question one, but for question two, the question which asks you about the usefulness of a source. When we are dealing with historical sources, primary sources, not interpretations, but sources that were produced at the time of the event that we're studying, whether that is a poster, whether it's the contents of a speech, whether it's the contents of a report, there are always things we need to think about, particularly for question 2. Now, I would suggest the most important thing that you do, so you're going to bring your highlighters into the exam. You're going to want to look at the provenance, aren't you? You're going to first of all, who produced this source? When was the source produced? Look for the dates. Who's the author of the source, or who's the artist? If it's a cartoon, who's the artist? Is the artist American or British, or is he working, or she working for the Soviet Union? Where was the source produced? So look for the time and place. And when you start thinking about things like that, and when you start looking at dates, you can, if your contextual knowledge is there, straight away you're going to be able to understand perhaps the circumstances in which the source was produced. What was going on at the time? What event is it depicting? And you might even be able to, from the provenance, you might even be able to decipher the purpose of the source. So if it's a Soviet propaganda poster, obviously the purpose of that source, it was produced to try to influence the way that people in Russia or the Soviet Union were to perceive an event. If it's a speech, if it's, say, a speech by Kennedy in Berlin in 1963, the purpose of that speech, of course, was to play up the propaganda potential of the Berlin Wall and how it was a massive PR failure for the Soviet Union. So the provenance is very, very important. That's the first thing you look at. Then I would say, you look at the content of the source. If it's a cartoon, look very carefully at the details of the cartoon, what it's depicting, what the, as I said, a little bit of basic inference, what's the message that's being communicated through the cartoon. If it's a speech or a report, what is the content of the source? Again, what is the focus? What's the emphasis? What is being communicated? And then you contextualize the context. How does this source relate to your wider understanding of the period? And is the source giving us credible information? Are there perhaps propagandist elements to it? So those are all the things to think about. So ultimately, what we're trying to encourage you to do is to develop a more complex appreciation of historical sources. And question 2 is going to ask you, how useful is this source? And that must drive your response. And when we're talking about usefulness of a source, we're talking about utility. Is how can we use this source? What can historians use this source for? If it's a source on the building of the Berlin Wall, how can historians use this particular source to build up an understanding of what was going on in Berlin in 1961? If it's a source about the Vietnam War, how can we use this source to understand, for example, US motives for getting involved in Vietnam? So use is, what can we use it for? How useful is it to historians studying, whatever topic that the source is focused on? All right, so that's really got to drive your answer. Okay, it must be about use. How useful is this? What can we use it for? How does it develop or expand our understanding of the given topic? So there's a little example here. This is perhaps a potential question one. Question one will always, the wording of the question is going to be exactly the same. It will say source A supports, and whatever topic they've decided to assess you on. So this is about NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and this this question asks you, this source A supports NATO. How do you know? Well, there's two things we have to do for this question. First of all, it's a 4 marker. So we're going to spend 5 minutes. Okay, no more than 5 minutes on this question. And there's there's two things you need to do. First of all, you need to look at the provenance. And second of all, you need to look at the details of the cartoon to infer its message. So, what does the provenance tell us? It tells us this cartoon was produced by the artist David Lowe 2 days, spelling mistake, I should say 2 days, after the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And that was in 1949. Now, it also tells us that David Lowe was an artist. He actually came from New Zealand, but he spent most of his life, most of his career, working in England. So he lived in the United Kingdom. So straight away, the provenance tells us that the artist lived in the UK. So he lived in England, which of course was a member and is today a member of NATO. So he is, by and large, going to be, putting forth a view that is pro-NATO and pro-West and probably anti-Soviet Union. So we got the first part of our answer there. The next thing you need to do is look at the actual details of the cartoon. Okay, so it shows Stalin playing cards with the leaders of the West. So you have in there, I can make out President Truman, of course, at the front. You have, I think it's supposed to be Clement Attlee, members of the Labour administration at the time. So you've got basically I think there's representatives of France in there as well. So you have the representative of Western governments. Now, if you look where they're sitting, you need to turn that map upside down. So you can see, if you turn it upside down, you can see the UK. Okay, and they're kind of sitting in the Atlantic Ocean, and they're sitting towards the United States. So that's what NATO was, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was a military alliance of Western Europe, so UK, France, Italy, all the Western countries, and of course America and Canada. Now, it's often been referred to as a nuclear umbrella because what it stipulated is that if any member of NATO was attacked, let's say the Soviet Union launched an all-out nuclear attack on West Germany. Beg your pardon, West Germany wasn't a member straight away. Let's say the Soviet Union launched a nuclear attack on France. That then would be a declaration of war, not just on France, but on every NATO member. So it was kind of promoted collective security amongst the Western powers. So, they've got extra cards up their sleeve. Whereas Stalin, well, the artist David Lowe is depicting him sitting on his own. Because, of course, at this point, the Soviet Union didn't have any formal military alliance. The Warsaw Pact wasn't set up until 1954. So it's clearly showing that in 1949, the West was in a stronger position than the Soviet Union. Now, as you know, this all came about because of the events of the Berlin blockade. It was a direct consequence of that. So we know the source supports NATO because it shows NATO in a positive light. It shows NATO in a position of strength. It shows the collective security of the Western leadership. And it shows Stalin and the Soviet Union isolated. And that's just from the content. And we know it supports NATO because the artist was living in the UK. And he produced, David Lowe is a very famous cartoonist. He's produced lots of these political cartoons, not just in the Cold War, but in the 1930s. And he continued well into the 1960s and 70s, I believe. So he was, a New Zealander living and working in the UK. So two things, provenance and content of the source. So what you must be able to do for this question, because it will always be a visual source, you must be able to infer the meaning. So you need to refer to the provenance and you need to refer to the details of the cartoon. Okay, like I say, one paragraph, 5 minutes. Do not spend any longer than 5 minutes on question 1 because it's worth 4 marks. Now, question 2. This is probably, I would argue, one of the hardest questions actually, in the two papers, paper 1, paper 2. This is a question that students oftentimes struggle with. I think I've said to you before that when I do my extended exams analysis and I compare our school with other schools, this is a question that students all across the country do find difficult. Now, again, the wording of the question is going to be exactly the same other than the last few sentences, so whatever they're going to assess you on. So this is an assessment that we put together for this year's Year 10. And there's a big possibility that the Berlin Wall could come up as a question too, so it's a good one to have a go at. So the question reads, study sources B and C. How useful are sources B and C to a historian? And here's the crucial part of the question now, studying the building of the Berlin Wall. Explain your answer using the sources and, of course, your contextual knowledge. So this is worth 12 marks, and you should spend 15 minutes at least on this question. Now, so let's do this together. We look at the provenance. Okay, source B. Now, sources B and C, you're going to get a mixture. One of the sources, normally source B, is a written source, and the other source will be a visual source. Okay, so that's a given. So one of the sources will be like this. It will be a written source, and the other source will be another visual source, like source A. Okay, so source B, let's have a look at the provenance, is adapted from the transcript of Khrushchev's words in a meeting between him and the leader of East Germany, and that was a man called Walter Ulbricht, on the 1st of August, 1961. So let's imagine that you've got your highlighters at this point. Okay. So this is a transcript of a meeting. So, someone was sitting there taking the minutes of the meeting, and it's written up. Okay. Now, don't get too pulled into the kind of sometimes simplistic reasoning, such as, the person recording the meeting might have misheard something, or, let's just assume. Okay, always assume that that the meeting has been, in this case, has been written up accurately. What I want you to focus on is that this is a meeting. It's a private meeting between Khrushchev and the leader of the GDR, Communist East Germany. And that was a man named Walter Ulbricht. Now, you don't need to know that, but if you do, that's great. Now, I'd also, if I was answering this question, I'd highlight that date. This is the 1st of August, 1961. And I'd think, right, okay, the question's asking about the building of the Berlin Wall. When was the Berlin Wall built? It was built on the 13th of August, 1961. So this is around 2 weeks before the wall was built. Okay, so this gives us important context. Straight away I'm thinking, this is a private meeting. So when people are meeting privately, so this isn't going to be published in the media, this isn't going to be broadcast on the radio. This is a private exchange between two leaders. So when there's a private exchange, people are often more candid, they're more honest. They don't have to worry about what the public's going to think. They speak as they see fit. And that is exactly what's happening in this source. Okay. Khrushchev says many educated people, scientists and engineers have fled the German Democratic Republic, communist East Germany. Now again, we know that's true. We know that by 1961, around 2 to 3 million people had used the border in Berlin to escape to West Germany. And he says something must be done to stop this loss of key people. This was known as the brain drain. The GDR economy was on its knees because it was losing its most talented citizens to the West. And Khrushchev said, we think that the current tensions with the West present a good opportunity to place an iron ring around Berlin. Notice that phrase, iron ring. Okay, he's talking about the wall, isn't he? He's talking about the barbed wire fencing that went up before the wall was built. And he goes on to say we can explain it because we feel threatened with war and want to keep out spies. So what he's saying here is that we know that the tensions with the West at this point were very, very high, because of the failure of the Paris Peace Summit after the U2 crisis. We know that the relationship between the Soviet Union and America was breaking down. So he's saying we can use that tension as an excuse to put the wall up. Okay? And we're going to use the excuse, basically, we feel threatened, and of course we want to keep out spies. And it was very well known that Berlin was used, the CIA, MI6 used the open border in Berlin to send their spies into the East. And likewise, the Soviets did the same. The Stasi and KGB would travel into West Berlin to spy. So he's going to use that as the excuse. The Germans will understand this explanation, he says. Russian troops should man the ring, but your troops, and he's talking specifically to the leader of the GDR, should control the checkpoints. Okay, so there's going to be, Soviet military involvement, but not to the extent where it looks like it's Russia pushing this. They're going to sort of, dress it up as, the German soldiers will control the checkpoints. So this must happen, he said, before the conclusion of a peace treaty, so we can use it as a bargaining tool and show that we mean business. Now, we know that the Khrushchev had issued an ultimatum over Berlin in 1958. We know he was desperate for some resolution to the Berlin crisis. We know that the western sector of Berlin was a colossal embarrassment for the Soviet Union. Stalin had tried to drive them out in 1948, but it failed. So they're going to use the building of the wall, the sealing of the border, as a bargaining tool to show we mean business. And he said, if we are forced to war, then there will be war. So that last sentence is very, very interesting because it shows that Khrushchev was absolutely prepared to take the Soviet Union to war over Berlin. Now, we know from our contextual knowledge that it did almost come to war 2 months after the building of the wall at Checkpoint Charlie, when the tanks went nozzle to nozzle. So this, if I was a historian studying the building of the Berlin Wall, there's an awful lot that I could use this source for. It really gives me a very good insight into why the wall was being built, because it was to stop the mass exodus of East Germans to the West. But more importantly, how they were going to spin it. They were going to say, they're building the wall. And they did. They went on to call it the anti-fascist barrier. The justification was that Western spies were using the open border in Berlin to penetrate the Soviet Union. So he's telling Walter Ulbricht, the leader of East Germany, how they're going to spin it. He's also saying, the Soviet military will be there. They're going to kind of back it up, but it's going to appear as if this is being enforced by the East German troops. And lastly, he says, we're going to use it as a bargaining tool, and if necessary, we'll go to war over this. So there's an awful lot. A historian wanting to know about the building of the Berlin Wall, a huge amount you can take out of this source. So it's an incredibly useful source. The content is very, very useful. The provenance is equally useful. Now, the next source, now this won't actually come up as a question 2, because this source has actually come up as a question 1. But nevertheless, for the purpose of this exercise, I think it's a really good source to work with. Now, this, of course, is an American cartoon from 1961, showing Khrushchev talking to Kennedy alongside the newly built Berlin Wall. And first of all, it's an American cartoon, so we're now, whereas source B, of course, was, looking at the Soviet perspective, we're now looking at the American perspective. We're looking at, how the building of the wall was perceived in the West. You can see from the details here, Khrushchev has got a folder under his arm that's, he's talking. You see the caption of the cartoon about he's now ready to negotiate. You can see the barbed wire. You can see the tanks. So, the American perception was quite clear. This was an act of aggression to force negotiations, to force the West out of Berlin. The perception clearly from the cartoon was that he was prepared to go to war because of the tanks. Now, sometimes, the danger with these type of sources is that sometimes students fall into sort of, the trap of giving literal interpretations. So, do avoid that. It's, sometimes students might say, well, Khrushchev is, clearly, Kennedy looks scared and Khrushchev's threatening him, and let's get beyond making simplistic statements about surface feature details. The important thing here is looking at the caption. Look at specific details of the cartoon. So he's got a briefcase under his arm. So he's, now in a position of strength to negotiate, possibly trying to enforce the ultimatum that the West ignored in 1958. But more importantly, the American media at the time clearly believed that that this was an act of brinkmanship, and that he was, quite prepared to go to war over the Berlin issue. So have a go at planning an answer to this question. So what we must do is explain the uses of the provenance. What can we learn about the provenance? Then we need to explain the uses of the content. How can we use, how does the content give us an insight into the building of the Berlin Wall? Now, the crucial thing for this type of question is the judgment. So you're really going to look at 3 paragraphs here. 1 paragraph on source B, 1 paragraph on source C, and then a judgment paragraph, or at least half a paragraph. And to do that, you need to explain how both sources are useful, taken together. Now, taken together, the sources are useful because they give us a Soviet perspective on the building of the wall. They give us an American perspective on the building of the wall. And crucially, the sources actually corroborate one another. Source B really gets into this idea that Khrushchev is prepared to go to war over Berlin. He's going to use the wall as bargaining power. And that's exactly the message being communicated from source C. So the sources give us differing perspectives, the Soviet and the American perspective, but equally they give us, when taken together, it's quite clear that source C corroborates that what is being communicated in source B. All right. So that is something to think about for the very top level answers. Okay, when you coming to demonstrate a complex evaluation of both sources with a judgment. Okay, and you're not just using the content of the source, but you're using the provenance as well. So content, provenance, both sources together. 3 paragraphs. Okay, so that's our AO3. That's our source skills. Let's move on to AO2. And the skill that I'm talking about now, of course, is your answers to question 3 and 4, the extended question, the question 8, write an account, and of course the 16 mark evaluation question. And obviously, for these questions, you've got to try as best you can to implement your point, evidence, explain. Okay, so we want to see evidence of, an examiner is going to want to see evidence of developed reasoning. Point, evidence, explanation. Directing the evidence to the issue in the question. So if it's, the question 3, write an account, we know that these questions are focused predominantly on cause and consequences. The questions are always going to ask you to some extent about how a particular Cold War development increased tensions. So focusing is on the cause of the increasing tensions and the consequences of the event that you're looking at. Now, there's so many different areas that they could focus on for this question. There's a few ideas here on this slide as to where they might go. So it's as well that we need to try to be prepared for all eventualities. And again, there are some potential question 3s here. Some of them are taken straight from the question packs that I gave out some time ago. And what I would suggest, in the day or 2 before the exam, just try to practice. Take a couple of questions there and just practice a couple, put some plans together for a couple. I think the best way to to revise for me personally is exam practice. So you could get a question on the Cold War in Asia. It hasn't been assessed that much, so it's very good chance that this could come up. So you've got an exemplar here. Okay, so write an account of how the Korean War increased Cold War tensions between 1950 and 1953. So what, ideally for this type of question, 2 paragraphs, you're going to spend 10 minutes. Okay, so really, again, it's cause and effect. You're looking at, how did the Korean War, increase Cold War tensions? So there's a large emphasis, I would suggest, on consequences here. But we know, Kim Il-sung, the leader of North Korea at the time, he wanted to bring all of Korea under communist rule. The Stalin, the Soviets backed him. They backed him with resources. Stalin didn't want to get the Soviet Union directly involved. He didn't want Russian boots on the ground in Korea. But he used it as a proxy war, and he certainly gave a lot of resources and training to the North Koreans. So much so that they were very, very confident that they could win a quick, decisive war against South Korea. The US got involved. They did it under the auspices of a collective UN response, and they did that because at the time the Soviets were boycotting the UN Security Council over their protest that the US refusal to acknowledge communist China as the legitimate Chinese government. But the most important thing, I think, for this question is then to really get into the consequences. How did this escalate Cold War tensions? And this is, if you haven't revised the Korean War for a while, you should remember at the very least that once the UN got involved, the North Korean forces were quickly pushed back, not just in South Korea, but they were pushed back to the border of China. And so there was a change in US strategy. went from containing communism, i.e. expelling communist forces from South Korea back to North Korea, to rolling back communism off the Korean peninsula altogether. That brought China into the conflict. And from that point on, for a while, the fortune of the war changed back in favour of the North Koreans and the Chinese. And General MacArthur, who was leading the UN war effort, threatened the atom bomb, threatened to use the atom bomb against China. Now, of course, at this point, the Soviet Union are now in possession of nuclear weapons. And so what it did, this war threatened to become an all-out nuclear confrontation between East and West. So that's the really important conclusion to draw there, that it threatened to become a major Cold War confrontation. So as I say, if you want to, for a question like that, for this type of question, write an account, level 4, 7 and 8 marks, you want to show evidence of complex thinking, and you'll need to think about cause and consequence in 2 P paragraphs, 10 minutes. Another possible question 3 they haven't asked yet is to write an account of how the Berlin blockade increased tensions. Again, the approach is exactly the same. We need to be thinking about causes and consequences. This exemplar was on last year's resource, so hopefully you've had a chance to look at this already. Again, the big thing with the Berlin blockade was that Stalin's blockade of Berlin to try to force the Western powers out in 1948 led the West, of course, to fly in supplies. Then there was always the threat that Stalin would order the Soviet Air Force to shoot down the British and American planes engaged in the airlift. And to that end, we know that the United States was planning on dropping nuclear bombs on strategic Soviet locations. So it could have, the consequence here, of course, was that in the immediate consequences, this could have really kicked off World War III. But what it does do, of course, and going back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this session, it led the Western powers to come together to promote collective security, and so we see the creation of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And I think historians have very much agreed that the Cold War really got going over Berlin in 1948, 1949. Yes, the Western and Soviet powers had been falling out and disagreeing about a lot of things, most notably, of course, the reconstruction of Germany, but this was the first direct potential military flashpoint. Okay, so we're going to move on to question 4. And obviously the key skill here is really it's extended writing. It's I won't call it an essay. It's not quite an essay. Essays are, for those of you thinking about A-level, your essays will really come at A-level. It's not an essay, but it is extended writing. And you are really going to try to write 3 paragraphs to this question, and you're going to spend about 20 minutes on it. Okay, so it's the big one. It's 16 marks, and it has 4 additional marks for accurate spelling, punctuation, and grammar, and that is not to be underestimated. Those, even if your answer isn't great, but it's very well crafted and beautifully written, you've got 4 extra marks there. Okay, and sometimes we're dealing with such fine margins. Those 4 extra marks, or those 3 extra marks, or maybe just been 2 extra marks, could be the difference between a grade 4 and a 5, a 5 and a 6, a 6 and a 7. So we must bear that in mind. Okay. But what we're looking for, the skill in this question, is judgment. Is developing a substantiated judgment. So in other words, a well-supported judgment. I prefer the word judgment. I don't like the word conclusion. Judgment. Now, a common mistake is to kind of put too much emphasis to a bolted-on judgment in that last paragraph. Good answers the judgment, the decision that you come to, it should be evidenced throughout your answer. So it should be absolutely clear in your first paragraph whether or not you believe the stated factor was the most important factor in escalating Cold War tensions. It should be absolutely clear where you stand on your second or third factors in your second paragraph. And so then by the time you get to your concluding paragraph, your third paragraph, it is just a question of extrapolating, bringing together the case that you've already made, as it were. All right. Now, this is something that have been looking for. This is something I know my colleagues teaching and examining this all over the country are really looking for. So judgments aren't just something that you bolt on to the end of the answer. Good answers, your judgment, your decision should be evidenced throughout your answer. Now, possible topics. Now, last year it was the question was the U2 crisis the most important factor for increasing tensions in the 1960s? So that being said, I'd be surprised if they went for the 1960s again. So they might do. So if they do, they could focus on the building of the Berlin Wall. That hasn't come up yet in the previous questions on Cold War tensions in the 1960s. You could have a 16. Certainly, it's very probable that they might go back to the origins of the Cold War. So looking at events from 1945 to 1949 this year, that could have, there's so many possibilities there. They could ask you about the Truman Doctrine. They could ask you about the Marshall Plan. Okay, so the key thing is, we know from this question, whatever they give you as a stated factor, I would suggest look at that first. And then in your second paragraph, perhaps you examine another two factors. So if it's on the origins of the Cold War, in this case, I've said the Truman Doctrine was the most important reason for the development of the Cold War up to 1949. You'd look at how did the Truman Doctrine develop Cold War tensions? Well, the Soviets saw it as an aggressive policy, that Truman was using this as an excuse to establish America as a global policeman, and we know that the Truman Doctrine, this policy of America, was committing itself to containing communism. We know that found its biggest expression through the Marshall Aid money. And so that led to, if you remember, all the accusations that, America was trying to create a financial empire using this, justifying it as a sort of a way of fighting communism, but was really trying to control Western Europe. So that, of course, was one of the reasons that Stalin, wanted to get the West out of his zone of Germany. You could also argue, I think a second factor in that question was a very good factor, of course, would be the Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe. We know that the Truman Doctrine, was a response to the Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe, that Stalin was intent on stamping his authority on countries such as, of course, East Germany, Bulgaria, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. Winston Churchill had warned about that in his Iron Curtain speech of 1946. So you've got, again, cause and effect. What's the most important here? It all depends on whether you see the Truman Doctrine as reactive, reacting to Soviet expansion, whether you believe that the Truman Doctrine was effectively a cover, an excuse to justify American domination of Western Europe. So there's something like that could well come up. That I think that's a good area to revise, prepare for question 4. Now, one of the questions we are going to have a quick look at is the third one. The main reason for the development of détente in the 60s and 70s was concern over the arms race. Détente has only been assessed as a question 1 So it's another area of the spec that has been under assessed. We're going to come back to that one in a minute. Another potential question. The main reason for the development of the Cold War in the 1950s was the space race. How far do you agree with this statement? Explain your answer. So clearly this, again, the 1950s could come up because last year it was the 1960s. The 1950s has come up before in the context of the arms race and then the Korean War. So again, you'd start with the space race before you'd look at other factors. So we know that the space race, of course, that the Soviets had the lead on the space race, and the launch of the Soviet satellite Sputnik caused great alarm in the United States. It led to America establishing NASA. There were real fears that in the Soviets, if they had satellites in space, that those satellites could be weaponized. So it did really, and of course, the important thing, the space race and the arms race are two sides of the same coin. Once they had developed rockets powerful enough to leave the Earth's atmosphere, that was the beginning of the intercontinental ballistic missiles, the ICBMs. So the space race really led to the development of nuclear missiles. All right, so that's a really good one. That's a really good factor, and I would probably say, if you can link the space race to the escalation of the arms race, I think it was a very, very important, probably the most important factor for rising Cold War tensions. Other things you could look at, of course, were the Korean War and the Hungarian uprising. They might ask also for a question again in the 1950s, but this time with an emphasis on increasing Cold War tensions in Asia. Now, with regards to China, we know that China fell to communism in 1949, and the Soviets and the Chinese agreed a treaty of friendship. That led to a massive paranoia in America. The crucial thing there is the National Security Council produced a very, very alarmist document in which they basically said if America was going to contain communism globally, it had to spend far more money on weapons of defense, and so that led to the development of the arms race. So that was a very, very important consequence there. But of course, your second paragraph, you're going to want to talk about other factors. You're going to talk about the Korean War and how that almost led to a nuclear confrontation between America and China and the Soviet Union. And then you could also talk about the beginnings of the Vietnam crisis. So Vietnam, of course, the French rode back into Vietnam because it was a French colony before World War II, and that led to a bitter war between the Vietnamese and the French, which of course led to the French defeat in 1954. Now, after that time, Vietnam was divided between North and South Vietnam, North Vietnam being communist, South Vietnam, of course, being, in inverted commas, democratic. And, America gets more and more pulled into that conflict, and by 1959, 1960, the conflict is becoming more and more Americanized after North Vietnam declares war on South Vietnam in 1959. So, be prepared. That's a good question to have a go at, I think, or at the very least plan it, because it's it's another area of the specification perhaps that hasn't been assessed as much as it should have been. So there's a sample P paragraph here for the stated factor in the Berlin question. Like I said, I don't think they'll go for the 1960s again this year, because it came up last year. So the question I want to talk to you a little bit about for the last 5 minutes, and then we're going to finish, is détente. Now, on the more extended PowerPoint and the more extended video from last year, which you have access to on the same thread and Teams, have a look at that, because it's really important that that we understand what détente was all about and why it happened. So our period ends in 1972, and I guess it's fair to say that in 1972 one could have been forgiven for thinking really the Cold War between certainly America and the Soviet Union was over. So détente is that period of time where there was this thawing of relations. The relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States improved dramatically. And again, I just want to reiterate, this has been significantly under-assessed. So it is, I would really encourage you, if you haven't already done so, to try to complete the plan on this presentation. So détente really, it got going as early as 1963. So, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, you have America and the Soviet Union coming dangerously close to all-out nuclear war. And that led to a period of introspection on both the part of Kennedy and Khrushchev. They both realized that they had engaged in this brinkmanship, and the world had almost been wiped out in a catastrophic nuclear war. So initially there was a partial test ban treaty. There was a hotline set up for direct communication between the Kremlin and the White House. But I think most historians would agree that détente really got going in the late 1960s. And it really got going with President Nixon. So as we know, Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. He was replaced by President Johnson, who got so far into Vietnam, he kind of lost focus on pursuing better relationship with the Soviet Union. But Nixon came to power. He really pursued a better relationship with the Soviets. We have a change of leadership in the Soviet Union as well. Khrushchev was sacked in 1964. And he was replaced by Brezhnev. And Nixon and Brezhnev, had a pretty good relationship. They got on very, very well. And so, what this question is asking you is what was the most important factor about why détente really got going? And the stated factor is concern over the arms race. And so, certainly by 1968, there was this recognition that both East and West were spending way too much money on nuclear weapons and the Cold War. And so they pursued test ban treaties. They pursued what became known as SALT I, and that is an acronym for Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, which became a treaty. And it was, a recognition that couldn't continue. That particularly in the Soviet Union, the Soviet economy was being drained, by all the money that was being spent on the Cold War. So there was the concern over the arms race, and how close that they had come to all-out nuclear war in 1962. There was the financial cost of the arms race. Now, I think another important factor was China. And Nixon was very clever, because China and the Soviet Union, that relationship deteriorated very, very quickly. And Mao, the communist leader of China, always felt that the Chinese were treated as sort of second fiddle to the Soviets. He wanted China to be the dominant partner in that relationship. And so Chinese-Soviet relations were pretty much at rock bottom. Mao took every opportunity he could to criticize the Soviet leadership, particularly over the Cuban Missile Crisis. And what Nixon was trying to do, and this relates to Vietnam, he was trying to get the Chinese and the Soviet leadership on board, to get them to convince the North Vietnamese to agree to, a favorable peace deal. But he also recognized that by opening up relations with China, by establishing a relationship with Mao, that he could isolate the Soviet Union. And that would make the Soviet Union far more malleable or open to the idea of improved relationships with America. So there was a lot going on. I'm not sure if they would phrase the question exactly like that, but and it may well be. The specification is what, 5 years old now. It may well be that this is a question they might leave to the very end of the spec. I don't know, but it has been under assessed, and it is something that I think you need to be prepared for. Okay, so I would strongly suggest that once this session's finished, and even if this is something I'll be encouraging people to do tomorrow in the actual revision lesson, if you're there, is to go away and plan that answer. Right, so we're at 55 minutes. We're almost there. You're almost there. So what I'm going to say tomorrow is, it's kind of over to you. Yeah, we'll do the breakfast revision lesson on the morning to go over a few things, but it's your time now. So keep calm. Remember to breathe and stay focused. Don't. Anxiety can be a debilitating thing. Okay, you can get so focused on your anxieties that you just lose sight of what's in front of you. All right, so just remember to stay centered, stay calm, breathe, believe in yourself, believe in your abilities. Do the practical things. Just remember those timings: 5 minutes, 4 marks, 10 minutes, 8 marks, 20 minutes, 16 marks. If you do that, you're not going to run out of time. Do your best. That's all you can do. Okay? It's just, I'm a big believer in life that if you go out and give of your best and give of your absolute best, okay, just give it everything you've got, and no one can ask any more of you than that. So go and smash it out of the park. I'm sure you're all going to do well. So if I don't see you tomorrow, all the best of luck. But I'm hoping I'll see most of you, and we can run through a few more things perhaps tomorrow. Bye for now.